Hello, I welcome you all to our discussion on the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voice, brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. Today I have just one point to make, and my topic today, the topic I want to discuss today is the African Sign Languages and the legacy of Andrew Foster. The African Sign Languages and the legacy of Andrew Foster. If you are aware of sign languages, are aware of deaf education, and also deaf history, especially in Africa, you should be very much aware of Reverend Dr. Andrew Foster. And a lot of deaf people and a lot of sign language interpreters know about Andrew Foster. And it may interest you to know that Reverend Andrew Foster has been referred to as the father of deaf education in Africa, and some have also called him the father of sign language in Africa, even though that is not a very correct representation of him and the work he did. Alright, who is Andrew, or who was Andrew Foster? We will start by looking at who Andrew Foster was. Andrew Foster was a deaf African American. Andrew Foster was a graduate of Gallaudet University. Andrew Foster was a missionary who came to preach the gospel to the people, deaf people in Africa, but primarily he came to teach deaf children in Africa. Andrew Foster was a husband and also a father of children. Andrew Foster was born in June 27, 1925 in Birmingham, Alabama. And he lived his life, the rest of his life, after 11 years. As a deaf man, he lost his hearing to spinal meningitis at 11. So, Andrew Foster was the man who graduated from Gallaudet University and said, I am going to Africa because I want to provide education to deaf children in Africa. Okay, what are the legacies, or what is the legacy of Andrew Foster, and how does it interact with the indigenous sign languages that we are discussing today? Andrew Foster decided to come to Africa to teach deaf children. Against every discouragement, studies show that he was discouraged by friends and maybe family members or whatever, and but he said his heart was into doing this. And when Andrew Foster came, he arrived West Africa, particularly Ghana, in 1957. He established about 32 schools in 13 African countries, and this is according to Ranos 2017. I have also seen a record that says he established 31 schools in 17 African countries. Whether it is 31 or 32 in 13 or 17 African countries, just go home with the fact that Andrew Foster established deaf schools in many African countries, especially the West African countries. He introduced the popular total communication method to teach deaf children. He introduced the method that became popular during his time, and immediately after that, until some recent time, that is called total communication, teaching the deaf how to lip read and sign, and if necessary, talk. And he introduced this with the sign language that he came with. He also introduced a foreign sign language that later became the urban, or what we call the school sign today in many African countries. Let's see the picture the way it is. Some scholars believe that Andrew Foster was a bilingual signer of ASL and signed English, and he came to Africa to teach deaf children, and he taught African deaf children in these varieties of sign language that he used. The account of Andrew Foster's work in Ghana that suggests that in a Domorobe village that he kind of exchanged sign language knowledge when he wanted to teach the deaf children there, that they taught him a Domorobe sign language. I have not seen a lot of account of that, but I mean some scholars believed that that happened. All right. Now, having known Andrew Foster and what he did, we are so much aware of the fact that Andrew Foster worked with the government of different countries that he came into. He came to Nigeria in 1960 after he left Ghana, having worked for about 3 years. It may interest you to know that Andrew Foster entered into the countries, almost all the countries that he got into them when they had gained independence. Ghana gained independence in 1957. Andrew Foster got into Ghana that same year. As if he was waiting for Nigeria to get independence, Nigeria gained independence in 1960. Andrew Foster arrives in Nigeria that same year. Now, it is Adelogbe, if I got the pronunciation correct, that suggested that prior to Andrew Foster's arrival, the deaf education had been going on, but not necessarily with a signing method, just like it was going on in some European countries, as at that time, even before that time, when deaf children were being taught to speak, were being taught through the oral method. This was also going on, according to Adelogbe, in Nigeria around the 1950s. And there had been some kind of trainings of deaf educators, some of whom had the opportunity to travel abroad, especially France and Britain, to train, to teach deaf children. But there was no emphasis if these trainings enabled the teachers to introduce sign language in teaching them. If there was a method that introduced sign language, it was kind of scanty. So it was when Andrew Foster came that sign language was introduced in full-fledged way, that deaf children were taught to sign, even though they were also taught to lip read. And this is the legacy of Andrew Foster. Now, in our studies, we know that not many people have looked into Andrew Foster's work in this perspective. Everybody knows that he introduced deaf education in a very more standard way in West African countries, and everybody is at home with the fact that his work, it still speaks volume till today. But not many of the times have we seen people talk about Andrew Foster's work in terms of the impact of the introduction of the foreign sign language that he did on the indigenous sign languages. So the legacy of Andrew Foster in relation to the indigenous sign languages has been part of our studies, over the period of years. And we came to understand that as Andrew Foster introduced sign languages, the foreign sign language, as Andrew Foster introduced the foreign sign language into the indigenous communities, even though some of the communities, or many, were urban, but at least into the African communities, the indigenous sign languages that the different deaf children came to school with, some of whom had home sign experiences, some of whom may have been in communities where there was established sign language. According to Schmolin 2003, she mentioned that the deaf people who went to school from the communities that had established sign languages, there was a kind of displacement. They began to drop the indigenous sign languages and pick up the sign language that was introduced through Andrew Foster that has become the sign language of education. The foreign sign language that Andrew Foster introduced became the language of instruction in the deaf schools. And the indigenous sign languages that were being used in the countries where Andrew Foster worked became threatened. They became threatened and were regarded as local, inferior, unrefined, and unsophisticated, like we mentioned in the last week. It was at the point where deaf children began to learn sign languages in school, the point when deaf children and even adults, I know we talk about deaf children a lot because our work is focused on the deaf children. So even deaf adults, those who became deaf later in life, who went to schools to learn sign languages, some of whom came from communities where there were established sign languages, they began to look at the indigenous sign language systems as inferior, unrefined, unsophisticated, and local. Till today, a lot of deaf people and a lot of hearing people that use sign language regard the indigenous sign languages as local, regard indigenous sign languages as inferior. And this is a notion that we want to correct in our work, because we know that no language is inferior to the other and none is superior to the other. And this is also the reason we have contended, or most of the times, that the introduction of the foreign sign languages in the West African communities demeaned the indigenous sign languages. It belittled the indigenous sign languages. It made the indigenous sign languages to lose value, to lose essence, not just amongst non-sign language users, but unfortunately among sign language users, both deaf and hearing. And so in today's discussion, we have a question, which is, if Andrew Foster did not introduce a non-indigenous sign language, do you think that indigenous African sign languages would have been far more developed? And this is a question I'm putting across to you, and I would like to get your response. If you like, you can send response to this video channel, what your idea is, and I would appreciate your response. What do you think? Do you think that indigenous African sign languages would have been far more developed if Andrew Foster did not introduce a foreign sign language that he used to teach deaf children? Remember, he trained a lot of deaf people and who were also sent abroad to study, who eventually became better in signing the foreign sign language, particularly ASL. So today, the impact of Andrew Foster's work, which by all means is a beautiful work that he did, is what we are looking at from the perspective of the impact it has on the indigenous sign languages. And the studies we have done shows that it does not do any of the indigenous sign languages good, because as the people began to run away from the responsibility of developing their sign languages because they have access to an alternative work which they feel is superior, which they feel is sophisticated, which they feel is refined, it brings an adverse effect upon the indigenous ones. And remember that our focus has been how language access can be created for deaf children born in hearing families, especially, who lack language access in the first 5 years of their lives. This is crucial, and this is so much happening in a lot of African communities. Alright, today, our topic, you will not forget, the indigenous sign languages of Africa and the legacy of Andrew Foster. Go ahead and answer the question. If you want to participate in this program, what do you think? Do you think that the indigenous sign languages of Africa would have been far more developed if a foreign sign language was not introduced into the African communities? Send us your questions and also subscribe to our YouTube channel and activate the notification. If you want to be part of this program, when we will be discussing the grammar of indigenous African sign languages, we would want you to either record the words or expressions we will send out to you in your own indigenous sign languages and send to us, or send your own suggestions, whatever you would like us to include into this discussion. Until then, I'd like to appreciate you for being part of this program, for coming here to watch us every week. This is the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. I will see you next week. Bye.